Hi, this is Russ Connie from Club Benchmarking. Today we're going to talk about food and beverage from the perspective of the choices that clubs make regarding their treatment of food and beverage as an amenity versus a profit center. This food and beverage clearly is a political football in the industry. It's one that frankly commands far too much boardroom time. And most of you that know us know we've done an awful lot of research around the actual facts behind food and beverage and its role in a particular club. So we're going to talk about the financial aspects of food and beverage, whether within the industry it is actually a profit center or an amenity. But maybe more importantly, we're going to talk about ultimately the decision of whether a club treats food and beverage as though it's a profit center or an amenity. Ultimately says a lot about the club, says a lot about the club's perception in its own value proposition. And we're going to show you a few interesting notions around the attributes of clubs that tend to treat food and beverage as an amenity versus those that try to generate profit out of food and beverage. I think you find it very interesting, and thanks again for joining. As many of you who have watched our videos in the past, you know that we like to give a little bit of foundational information on the industry and why topics like food and beverage, frankly, are maybe more challenging than they should be inside most clubs. This is a big industry. Clubs, if you look at sort of the CMA universe of clubs, it forms a $22 billion industry. It's very, very fragmented, which means that the typical player in that $22 billion industry, the typical club, is a $6, $7, $8 million club. There are a couple very large clubs, but by and large, it's an industry filled of a high number of small players, whereas other industries tend to be shaped like a pyramid, where you've got a few very large players and then a number of small players at the base of the pyramid. Clubs have a challenging governance model. That's not news to anybody on this video. Most clubs have about 11 people on the board. So you've got, 30, 40,000 people walking around this country that can raise their hand and say, I've got a role as a governance role on the board of my club. To make that more challenging, about a third of those people turn over every year, which means every 3 years there's a fresh new crop of 30 or 40,000 people. That's an extremely challenging environment, very, very taxing on the management structure of clubs, on the staff of clubs, and makes it pretty hard to have strategic consistency year over year over year, and certainly over a 5 or 10 year span with any one particular club. What we're all about here is trying to bring what we call fact-based governance into clubs, and by doing that, obviously you need facts, and facts are, we like the phrase facts align, opinions divide, and so what we try to do to the extent possible is replace opinion with fact. And we've certainly seen plenty of examples, but we know that when you do that, you create a little bit more process rather than politics inside the boardroom and inside clubs. And ultimately, you end up with more effective decisions, more effective decision-making process, and certainly less frustration. And so we're going to focus that particular discussion around food and beverage today, but ultimately that is the foundation of what we do, is applying facts over opinion. When you look at a new board coming on, it's challenging. You have to ask the question, how actually does a board begin to understand the club business? Certainly a lot of clubs have board retreats. I think they tend to focus really on the bylaws and maybe the role of the board and the governance process. They don't really focus quite probably as much as they should on what is the actual financial model of the club industry. What are the core financial drivers of clubs? What matters? What doesn't matter? What are some of the traps that people fall into? And certainly food and beverage, we do in fact call it the food and beverage trap. If you're sitting in a boardroom and you're having a 2-hour meeting and you're spending an hour talking about the finances of food and beverage, or the cost of food, or how many banquets you're going to have next month, pretty safe to say that you've fallen into that trap. And so the goal is to come up with a fact-based aligned view of what the drivers really are. That's what we're going to talk about here specifically to food and beverage, and we're going to look at some specific metrics that a club can monitor and understand. How do we tell whether we're pushing our food and beverage operation towards trying to be a restaurant, meaning making money, or whether trying to serve our members and give them the best possible food and beverage experience. You know, obviously we're data-focused folks here at Club Benchmarking. We like a quote from Edward Deming, who's well known as the father of management as a science. Love the quote: "In God we trust. All others bring data." And if you look outside the club world, in fact, that is the way major organizations and significant organizations and companies make decisions. They do it with data. They don't do it because someone has the loudest opinion, or someone seems to be the most confident that day. And so, we love that quote, and we think it applies directly to what we do. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is change and unify the dialogue so that you don't have a boardroom of 11 different opinions, or a boardroom of people saying, I think this, I think that. We're trying to change it from I think to we know. And when the sentences start with we know, and they're truly fact-based, you're marching down a different path than decisions or discussions that are based on I think. So this is all about putting F&B in context and getting specifically into F&B. These are all phrases that we've heard before. We should make money in F&B. We need more banquets, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are all examples. I mentioned earlier the F&B trap. I would say those are primary examples, frankly, of statements that are indicators of a club or a board having fallen into the F&B trap. We all know that food and beverage is a critical amenity in clubs. We certainly don't take the position that food and beverage is anything other than that. It is a brutally critical amenity. It's the social center of the club. It's where those bonds. Bonds certainly happen on the golf course. Bonds can happen on the tennis court. And certainly bonds happen in the food and beverage operation, whether it's in the grill room having a beer or having a nice dinner on Saturday night. But it's critical to the social center of the club, which is why, in fact, you want to treat it as an amenity which has critical importance. There's not a golf club out there that wouldn't say the condition of the course is critically important because it's directly correlated to the satisfaction of the members. Food and beverage is the same thing. And just like if you tried to make money off of the golf course, you'd probably be delivering a very different experience. The same thing really applies to food and beverage. Why is it discussed so much? Why is it so easy to fall into the trap? Frankly, it's because so much of a club's revenue comes from food and beverage. If you look at a typical club, 80% of its revenue comes from only two line items: dues and food and beverage. And we'll look at dues in a minute, but food and beverage makes up about a third of the revenue for the median club with golf in the country. So it's a big chunk of revenue. Any company that gets 30% of its revenue from one place would say, of course we have to focus on this. It's 30% of our revenue. How can we ignore this? Of course, the difference, if you're in the non-club world and you've got a product line that you're getting 30% of your revenue from, typically you would be generating margin off of that revenue. In other words, you'd be throwing cash off of, revenue minus COGS equals gross profit. You'd be throwing gross profit off of that revenue. We'll look in a minute. That is where the story is a little bit different in this revenue, this particular 32%. When we look at clubs without golf, it's the same story. The numbers are a little bit different, but even more of the revenue comes from food and beverage. It's about 42% at the median, but it's the same natural flow, is especially if you have a boardroom full of business people that see 30-40% of the revenue coming from one place are going to just have a natural affinity for wanting to spend time talking about that particular service line or product line. Now, not going to dive into these pie charts. A lot of people have seen these before, and it is the difference between revenue and margin, right? Margin is what's left after the cost of goods sold for that dollar of revenue. And while I'm not going to go into these pie charts specifically, the bottom line is there is no, these pie charts represent the sources of gross profit in clubs. And at the middle of the industry, and certainly for the majority of clubs, we'll look in a minute, there is no slice that says food and beverage. In other words, food and beverage does not produce gross margin. So while it reflects a high proportion of the revenue of the club, it actually doesn't produce any margin, meaning there's no cash flowing out of it such that it can help pay for other things like course maintenance, like buildings and operations, like G&A, all the things that other revenue lines of the club that do produce margin, frankly, namely dues being the most important, obviously. That's what ultimately pays for the fixed expenses of the club. Food and beverage is not a source of that. If we look at, there's a very interesting relationship between these two most prevalent sources of revenue in clubs, dues and food and beverage. Many of you have heard us talk quite a bit about gross margin in clubs. Gross margin is frankly a notion that hasn't been talked about much in clubs, and it's talked about extensively in business outside of clubs. And the reason for that is fairly intuitive and obvious, in that as the gross margin goes, so goes the operating result of the club, the income result of the club. And, Business 101 explains that higher gross margin generally correlates to higher operating income. Lower gross margin will correlate to lower operating income. And when companies on Wall Street report their quarterly earnings, other than revenue, earnings per share, the next big three number they look at is gross margin, because they understand that gross margin is what funds the ability of the club to keep the company to keep pouring money into R&D or marketing and sales or the fixed expenses for that operation that really end up producing at the end of the day the net operating result. So what we see is, if you look at the relationship, what are the attributes of clubs that have low gross margins? Those clubs tend to have less of their revenue coming from dues and more of their revenue coming from food and beverage. Clubs that have high gross margins tend to have more of their revenue coming from dues and less of their revenue coming from food and beverage. Now, again, this isn't to say that the most successful club is the club that drives food and beverage revenue to zero and is only a dues revenue line type of club. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is, ultimately, you need to have the right mix that puts you at an aggregate gross margin that produces enough cash to fund the fixed expenses of the club, so that you're operationally supported and that you're not burning cash operationally and therefore stealing your capital to patch that up. So it's really about understanding that you have revenue that's high margin, revenue that's low margin. Dues revenue is all about funding the club. Food and beverage revenue is a great proxy for how active is our membership, are folks coming in and using the club, and it's a great measurement for what's our level of activity and what are the things we might do to drive more activity. But since it doesn't produce margin, it's not a place to help try to fund the club. And certainly if your dues is weak and you're trying to make up for that in food and beverage, obviously you end up falling to this side of the ratio where you've got lower and lower percent coming from dues and higher percent coming from food and beverage, and we see what that does to the gross margin. So we've been going around the country, we say we're on several missions. One of the missions being that we're trying to have food and beverage discussed less in the boardroom, taking up a lower amount of time in the boardroom. Certainly the finances of food and beverage taking a lower percentage of time of discussion in the boardroom. The reason we say that is because it's not the financial driver that people think it is. So let's just start with a couple facts here. If we look at the industry, and this is the break-even line for food and beverage, what we do is, the way we measure food and beverage in context to the club is we simply take the operating result of food and beverage and we divide it by the gross profit of the club, because that puts it in context. If you're a $10 million club, a $200,000 food and beverage loss means something different than if you're a $2 million gross profit club. So by having that in context with gross profit gives you a relevant scale, not just an absolute dollar scale. And we can see very easily, and we know, that 3/4 of the clubs in the industry lose money in food and beverage, and about 1/4 of the clubs break even or throw off a little bit of cash. We know that it's a fact that at the middle of the industry, the loss of food and beverage equates to about 4% of the club's gross profit. Now remember, the gross profit is the money required to fund all of the fixed operating expenses of the club, the course, G&A, buildings, there's six departments that basically every club has. So it's 4 cents on the dollar. It's not 50, 60 cents on the dollar. And for the vast majority of clubs, whether they're profitable or at a loss, that relative scale of the subsidy or surplus in food and beverage, if we say that 10% is a good mark to measure significance, the vast majority of the industry, 95% of the industry, food and beverage result, whether it's positive or negative, does not relate to a statistically significant number, meaning it's less than 10%. So that's critically important. Now, one may think that by looking at this chart, that the clubs down on this end of the scale are doing a poor job managing food and beverage because they're throwing higher levels of subsidy. More of their food and beverage has a loss, which equates to a greater percentage equivalent to their gross profit. Actually, the opposite tends to be true. These tend to be the healthier clubs that truly embrace food and beverage as an amenity. They're all about delivering not a restaurant-like experience, but a club-like experience. They're not trying to make money off of that steak. They want to deliver a $60 steak at a $30 menu price because they know that member is going to walk away feeling like, I just got a great deal and I can't wait to get back here and eat again. The clubs up in the top right corner, they're the ones that tend to be trying to drive, clearly, profit out of food and beverage. Quite often it's because that the club may not have the same financial health that the clubs in the lower left experience, and thus they're trying to drive, they're trying to make money off of that steak, not trying to necessarily deliver the best possible experience and throw some subsidy along to back up that experience. So ultimately, we say food and beverage is an amenity, not a profit center. But these are choices that clubs make. Clubs can choose whether they're going to have a more quote-unquote pedestrian food and beverage experience and try to make money off of that transaction, or where they're going to have a five-star stellar food and beverage experience where they understand that the check is not going to cover the costs, and that's what dues is for. Dues is to make up the delta between the check and the cost of delivering that food and beverage experience. Now, interestingly, clubs fall into three categories, right? We'll call them the high subsidy clubs, and the low subsidy clubs, or maybe no subsidy clubs, where they're trying to make money off of food and beverage. And of course, you have clubs in the middle. But this next chart, it has a lot of numbers on it. We're not going to go through all this, but there are some clearly important messages and I think understandings and perceptions that come out of this. If we look at the clubs that were on the right side of that previous curve, in other words, the clubs that were trying to either break even or make profit off of food and beverage, we see a few interesting attributes. One, we notice that their food and beverage labor ratio, meaning loaded labor as a percent of food and beverage revenue, is about 54%. So 54 cents of every food and beverage revenue dollar goes towards food and beverage labor. And we can see that their initiation fee at the meeting is about $17,500. That's what that club looks like. They have 390 members. They have 6,600 in annual full member dues rate, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the clubs that are more towards trying to make money in food and beverage. We look at the high subsidy food and beverage clubs. Their initiation fee is 3 times as high, $52,000, and we can see they're actually throwing a lot more labor at food and beverage, at the food and beverage experience. 82 cents of every dollar of food and beverage revenue goes out as labor. Well, that's not hard to see that, all right, if 82 cents of every dollar is going to labor and my food cost is 45%, it's pretty easy to see that I'm well over 100%. So you start to understand that, in fact, the clubs that I think people would perceive to have a higher value proposition, we're certainly believers that clubs that can justify significantly higher initiation fees and even maybe significantly higher dues levels are the clubs that certainly have confidence in their value proposition. Clubs that are out there at low initiation fees, and certainly clubs get lower than $17,000. You've got clubs with no initiation fee, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 initiation fees, maybe don't quite have the confidence that they do in their value proposition. But Doesn't mean you can flip a switch and move from one of these to the other, but at least you start to see there are certain attributes of clubs that are perceived to have high value proposition, and maybe attributes that are of clubs that are perceived to have maybe a little bit lower value proposition. It doesn't mean one is right or wrong, by the way, because ultimately what you're trying to do is match the member expectation with the service delivery. But there clearly is a pattern between clubs that seem to command a higher initiation fee and thus a higher presentable value proposition, and those that have a lower initiation fee and lower value proposition. So again, it's a strategic discussion, and there are choices that can be made around which of these categories you tend to drive the club towards. Certainly, if we look at labor cost, we're going to take a quick look here at labor, the labor component, and the actual food cost. We're not going to talk a lot about it because I think the choices of where you want to be dictate your labor and your food costs, not the other way around. So, there are clubs that range a broad spectrum. If you're trying to manipulate the result of your food and beverage operation, in other words, what level of subsidy relative to my gross profit are we going to support? It ultimately is about labor. I mean, you've got 50 percentage points, labor going from 50% of revenue all the way up over to 100% of revenue, which some clubs do. That really is the knob to turn if you're looking to move one way or the other on food and beverage. Frankly, if you're trying to make food and beverage into a profit center, you ratchet down labor, and on a busy Friday night, it might take 20 minutes to get your drink. If you're up in this category, you want to make sure no matter how busy that grill room is or that dining room is, within 2 minutes, someone's at that table asking them, what they'd like to drink before dinner. And that really is the difference in experience that a club member is going to perceive quite quickly. And, that has legs to it. So that if that member brings in guests, and that member or prospective member, I suppose, sees the difference of service delivery of that one case versus the other case, I think that's not lost on people. They understand that. If you look at the actual cost percentages, I mean, obviously there is variation here, and certainly you want to be an efficient operation, and efficiency will drive your cost down. Menu prices obviously have an impact on that, but again, there's that relationship between, are we trying to make money off of that steak, or do we want that person leaving feeling like, they just got a $50 steak and it cost them $30, and they had a great food and beverage experience. So, not going to go too deep into this, but obviously the choices you make are going to have an impact both on the labor rate you're willing to support and the cost targets you're trying to hit for your operation. Quickly in closing, I mean, clearly food and beverage is an ultra important amenity. Quite often when folks do survey memberships, they find out that members joined, these are certainly for clubs with golf, members joined because of the golf course. But when they carry on that survey process over time for members that have been at the club for quite some time, they actually find that food and beverage becomes the most important amenity for members. And so it's clearly important, and which is why we believe, and we think that the data, the facts bear that out, that the clubs that truly embrace the notion of food and beverage as an amenity, meaning that it requires subsidy, those are the clubs that are really trying to deliver that stellar membership experience. And it's that stellar experience which is ultimately what gives you the confidence to start ratcheting it up for your initiation fee, having confidence in your initiation fee, setting your initiation fee out of confidence as opposed to out of fear. So that's an important aspect. The run it like a restaurant, any member can go to any restaurant and have a good meal. You don't want them, in my opinion, in our view, to have a restaurant-like experience. You want them to have a club-like experience. And a club-like experience says, the transaction, the actual meal itself, has some differentials that they could not have achieved in the restaurant world. The service was better. The quality of the food was better. The relationships are better. All those things require money over and above what the actual check supports. Phrase I love, which is food and beverage results are a reflection of the financial health of the club, not a driver of the financial health of the club. That correlates back to the discussion we had a minute ago around it's the healthier clubs that actually are on the lower left side of that curve we looked at, and the ones that quote unquote have a greater food and beverage loss, meaning that they have a higher subsidy they put towards it. Those are the healthy clubs. They can afford to have a higher subsidy going into that amenity. Of course, there's a chicken and the egg there, right? You have to get healthy to do that. You know, which comes first, and ultimately you want to try to emulate the attributes of the club you want to be, you know, and the members will then react. These are all choices that clubs make. There's no recipe, there's no cookie cutter for what the right thing to do for any one club is, but having the facts on the table around food and beverage as an amenity in your club, as opposed to food and beverage trying to be a profit center in your club, there are a lot of facts around that. We looked at a few, chasing that holy grail of food and beverage being a profit center, especially if the goal is, geez, our dues is a little bit weak, let's ratchet up the banquets to try to get to get over that hump. You know, there's not enough hamburgers in the world you can cook to try to replace dues revenue with food and beverage revenue. So that's a fallacy that doesn't really work. The math of the finances of the club don't bear that out. So be pretty careful about that one. I think with that, we're going to wrap it up. Obviously, we're always happy to answer any questions anyone has. Feel free to contact us at Club Benchmarking, and we hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks.